good to see all your faces popping up on screen, so many of you. I'm Pamela Johnson, one of the founders of Blue Door Press. I'm speaking from North London, so do put in the chat where you're zooming in from. Be really nice to know. And we're here officially to launch Blue Door's latest project, All Together Elsewhere, an online anthology. But before I introduce our three readers, I just want to say a little bit about Blue Door Press and how the project actually developed. Blue Door was founded in September 2016 as a collective of writers with associate editors and designers working to produce high quality literary fiction, memoir, non-fiction and poetry. And we release into the world roughly 2 books a year, which means there are now 9 physical books out in the world under the Blue Door imprint. And you can find out more about those books on our website. But as you can see, our way of working is quite slow and not for everyone. And we began to wonder last year, how can we get many more voices through the Blue Door? So last January, this is in our other lives, this is pre-COVID, we had our beginning of year meeting and came up with the idea for an anthology, writing particularly prose, which explored and evoked a strong sense of place. Frances Gilbert supplied the title, All Together Elsewhere, which is a phrase from a Northern poem. And there we were, all set to make a physical book. And then we know what happened by March. And the pandemic really just brought too much uncertainty to commit to a physical print production. And yet, All Together Elsewhere was exactly where we found ourselves in March, living under restrictions, unable to travel to faraway places, barely going beyond our front door. So it seemed the anthology idea was actually particularly timely. This would offer writers and readers a chance to become immersed in a particular place, whether from the past or somewhere we wish we could travel to, or a place closer to home that meant something special. Okay, so we can't physically be transported elsewhere, but we can, through reading that invites our thoughts and imaginations, we can travel. So this is really a new venture for Blue Door. It's online developing anthology. And our plan is to offer a fresh piece every month, giving each piece quite a strong focus, allowing readers to savour it, come back to it, and find out more about each of the authors. We're going to aim to publish a new piece on the last Thursday of each month. We will send out a reminder via the newsletter, letting you know what's coming up next. So if you're not on our mailing list for the newsletter, please do sign up via our contacts page, and I'll put that link in the chat so you can sign up if you wish. Just a quick word about submissions. You're going to see from the 3 readers tonight that though each piece is so different, what they all have in common is, and which is why we wanted them in the anthology, is that each writer has explored a deep and personal experience in a particular place. And each is written in a different form, a form that the experience itself seems to demand. So while we're not open to submissions for full book projects, we would like to say to any writers in the audience tonight, because I know there are a few, if you have an idea or a finished piece that evokes a compelling experience in a particular occasion, then we'd be happy to consider a submission. We're looking to hear from a diverse range of voices in diverse places. Submissions must be prose, fiction, memoir, personal essay, up to 5,000 words. So if you have an idea, do contact us and I'll put the link in the chat. So now to tonight. I will introduce each reader in turn. They will then introduce their work and read a short excerpt. After the readings, there will be time for a Q&A. Now, please, will you put your questions in the chat box as soon as you think of them? It's really helpful because I can then see the kind of issues that are coming up. You can ask me a question about Blue Door, or any of the writers a specific question about their place or their writing. As Frances has said, you are muted with the power to unmute yourselves, but please do stay muted during the reading section. And at the end, we will unmute you so you can applaud our three readers. And so, to our first contributor, Sarah Salway. Her piece, Learning to Breathe with Trees, is a really timely piece of writing, and we were delighted when Sarah agreed that we could publish this as the first piece in our anthology. It's already up there. It went up in January. Some of you may have read it. Sarah is a novelist, teacher, journalist, and poet. She's given a TED talk in praise of everyday words. You can see that on YouTube. She currently runs a reading group in Kent for the Royal Literary Fund. But in March 2020, she was hospitalised with COVID pneumonia. Happily, she is now recovered, but I'm going to hand you over to Sarah and she will explain how. So please welcome Sarah Salway.
Hi. Thank you, Pam. And thank you to Blue Door Press for giving Learning to Breathe with Trees such a good home. I'm going to read an extract from the middle of the essay. So I wanted to give you some context beforehand. And this book here, I don't know if it's Trees in Britain, is actually at the heart of it all. I worked for a bit as a volunteer at our local Oxfam bookshop, which was a complete disaster because I brought so many books. And I particularly loved the old non-fiction books that I felt I could kind of continue the story. And then when about 5 years ago, I came up with a plan to identify all the trees in our local park, I brought this book. And when I got it home, this tiny little postcard, you can see the size of it, came out, and it was the original order form from W.H. Smith's in Windsor, dated the 22nd of July 1948, to a D.H. Hardwick, Ward 18 military wing of the Harefield County Hospital. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. That's another story I could investigate. And I put it on the shelf for when I had some time. So then fast forward to last March, at the very beginning of the pandemic, as Pam said, I contracted COVID pneumonia, not the kind of early adopter that I wanted. And spoiler alert, I survived. But as part of my recovery, I started to write, and I was combining my story with what I discovered about D.H. Hardwick, the owner of this book. And so this essay weaves those two stories together. One of the common symptoms of the coronavirus is a difficulty in breathing, but doctors are finding some patients have silent hypoxia, the medical term for when someone has dangerously low oxygen levels, but is still able to function. This is the case with me. I'm hesitant about ringing 111 at first, but once the paramedics arrive and test me, it takes just minutes before I'm in an ambulance. From my seat in the back, I hear fragments from increasingly urgent telephone calls. Red route, need to be quick. And I wonder which poor person they're talking about, until I realize it's me. An hour later, I'm in a hospital bed on oxygen, remaining there for 6 days. When I come out, it's to a different world. The country's in lockdown because to touch someone could be to kill them. I'm still frail anyway, so it's enough for me to totter around the Grove, but doing the same route daily means I notice how much stronger I get as the weeks creep by. And like many others, I also start to notice nature more. Was this tree always this colour? A man asks me during one walk. He's standing by a copper birch, its rich purple leaves showcased by the smooth grey bark. I tell him I can't remember, but has he seen the Christmas tree blossoms on that horse chestnut? It seems the perfect time to go back to my old plan of learning the trees in the park by name. I get out my old book and the postcard falls out again.
It's time to read my dummy's computers book. Find out what to do with the dead broken one and how to buy one that works. I'm gonna tell Tina my specs because Tina.
Oh. Sorry, carry on, Sarah.
I'll unmute. Okay. It's easy to find out about Harefield Hospital. It's now one of the lost hospitals of London, but was once the home of an Australian family, the Billiard Leaks. They'd offered it for the treatment of injured Australian and New Zealand soldiers in wartime. And by 1940, it had gained an international reputation for treating injury to the lungs. D.H. Hardwick, the man, takes longer to track down. Eventually, I find out he was an officer of the Royal Air Force Voluntary Reserve, winning a Distinguished Flying Cross during the Battle of Arnhem. This was a brutal battle, and out of nearly 9,000 men taking part from Dennis's regiment, only 2,000 came home. So the man who first owned my tree book had officially been a survivor. And now I am one too. Apparently I have battled through. I am a warrior, and I've won the ultimate medal for 2020, COVID survivor. Stalking D.H. Hardwick online proves to be the perfect gentle distraction. From military websites, I found out his first names were Dennis Hendon, and he was born in Auckland in 1917. But what I still find most interesting about him was how, while he was recovering in a hospital so far from home, and several years after the war had ended, he had ordered a book so he could learn more about English trees. It seems an almost heroic curiosity and makes me ashamed of how I've been too busy to bother learning my own landscape properly. There are so many things we take for granted until we nearly lose them. Every day now, my phone fills with friends' photographs of flowers and skies, and I study everyone closely as if the natural world is a language I need to translate. A few years ago, I went to a workshop on natural navigation for an article I was writing about getting lost. In our introductions, one man announced he was a pilot. He could navigate anywhere in the sky, he said, but on land he was always getting lost. I think of Dennis Hardwick as rather like that pilot, still in a military hospital in 1948, unlikely to fly again. Perhaps he was navigating a way through his new landscape, starting with the trees. Did he know then that the average tree produces enough oxygen in 1 year to keep a family of 4 breathing? Both Dennis and I found ourselves desperately in need of oxygen, but I think trees gave us more than simply being the world's lungs when ours weren't working. Through them, we learnt a different language, a better way of understanding the world that we've been given the second precious chance to walk in. Perhaps us both owning this book at our different times is a sign of how we refuse to take that for granted. I imagine both of us wheezing gently through the same pages of the book, taking it out to the same types of parks, staring at the same leaves. I still don't know exactly what happened to Dennis after he left the hospital, but every time I search for D.H. Hardwick, almost the first hit is for a logging company in New Hampshire. Part of me hopes this business wasn't set up by my Dennis, and that his interest in trees wasn't just so he could learn which to cut down. Because when I walk around the grove with Dennis's book in my hand, I'm able to identify the lime, horse chestnut, holly, birches, both copper and silver, yew, whitebeam, hornbeam, and also the 2 Scotch pines that have sprung up in the corner where we used to dump our Christmas trees for the council to get rid of. It's true that knowing the names of the trees changes my walks, because I just don't go tree, tree, tree anymore. It slows me down. It feels as if I've added another I've added another layer to my landscape, almost as if the dial on a telescope has been turned up, so everything is now in focus. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Wow, thank you so much, Sarah. Brilliant. Really, really good piece. And that's our first in our anthology. So thank you for that. Next up is Mary Woodward. Her piece will take you to Turin, a city which she explored and found echoes of the poet Pavese. Her piece will be published next Thursday, 25th of February. Now, Mary describes herself as more of a poet than a writer of prose, which is not true at all, because I've seen both of her writing. But she has published one full collection of poetry, The White Valentine, Walpole Press, and Almost Like Talking, a pamphlet from Smith's Doorstop. Her poems appear all over the place in magazines. She has actually written for The Guardian. She won their fashion writing competition, and she's had prose in literary magazines and has published short fiction and has been shortlisted for short story competitions. So please welcome Mary Woodward to take us to Turin. Mary.
Hello, everyone. I actually went to Turin in search of Pavese. I'd been reading him for years, for quite a long time. I mean, for a while in this country, you could only read him in a little penguin. It was actually quite an unreliable selection of his work. And then in 2004, Carcanet published this beautiful book called Disaffections, which is his complete poems from 1930 to 1950. Wonderful dual text, nice introduction. And that fed my Pavese addiction for a couple of years. And I got to the point where I thought, I'm just actually going to have to go there. I've got to go and see this city that he writes about so much, because I'll never fully get the poems unless I do. So off I went to Turin. And when I came back, luckily, I had the sense to sit down and write this to try and catch a sense of what Turin felt like to me. So here it is. And I start off with a very short quotation from his last ever poem, which he wrote in English. His English was very good. All is the same, time has gone by. Someday you came, someday you'll die. I've never met anybody who's been to Turin, though I meet plenty of people who have never heard of it. Where's that, they say? Even Italians look blank or disapproving. Why go there? Northern, industrial. Why not Florence, Rome, Siena, if you're going to bother to go to Italy at all in winter? I persuade myself with the prospect of shimmering Alps encircling a shadowy, elegant city of Baroque streets, city of bookshops and Vivaldi manuscripts and Camparis at 7 o'clock on the way home. Pavese and Primo Levi's city, the home he walked back to from Auschwitz. I buy 2 maps, one laminated to withstand the rain I guess will be falling on the colonnaded street corners, and a real OS map, vast of thin white paper, as easy to fold as dealing with the canvas on a yacht in the wind. In the evenings before going, I spend hours looking at the neighbouring valleys and hills with a magnifying glass, scrutinising the city, giving names to streets and piazzas. The clocks go back. My life becomes 2/3 night and 1/3 the steel half-light of November days. This is a good time, the year's 11th hour, to visit a city which is reputed to be magic, one of a white or black, depending on who you read, magic triangle with London and San Francisco, Prague and Lyon. My brain concocts an atmosphere of its own for this unmet place. Roman military nerve center, the eyrie of the Dukes of Savoy, the place where Italy itself was plotted and planned in the great coffee houses. I imagine Pavese, heir to all this, sitting in the cafes Elena and Torino and San Carlo and Flora. Turin, city of fantasy, city of decorum, city of passion, city of irony, he says in his diaries. As the plane eases into its long sweep down over the autumn slopes of the Alps, I start to feel that I'm cheating, that I've taken a shortcut instead of what should have been a test of my determination, that I should have walked and struggled to reach here. That's what people did, isn't it, for millennia? Everybody once, not just Levy, walked through these valleys or rode horses, stayed at small pensions and set off for the next day's cold journeying. It was not meant to be this easy. But when I arrive, I am absorbed into the evening rush hour crowds as if being welcomed. It is warm. The trees which line every street and square are copper and sepia, as if it was still September. That first night, I go to the opera, an English company doing Billy Budd. The Via Roma is lit across from column to column for Christmas. Further along, a Jenny Holzer poem is moving in 10-foot high white letters up and over the Palazzo Madama in the Piazza Castello. Time is short, just enough to get into my black dress, a half hour to eat pizza and drink Prosecco in the cafe next to the Teatro Regio. The opera house is like a shoot in Italian Vogue. Dark red walls and carpets, a cloud of glass chandeliers and sweeping low aero-curved staircases. Carlo Molino's risen from the ashes of World War II theatre. Molino, the mysterious, magic-obsessed Torinese architect who flew Spitfires and designed a racing car which won at Le Mans. All the fur-coated women dangle Hermes or Chanel handbags. I already know the Hermes shop in the Via Roma is the only one in the world to use plain carrier bags, a benchmark of Torinese discretion. You can be rich here, but only with simplicity, a la Carla Bruni. Anything else would be bad manners. Afterwards, in the Cafe Moquita, I have a Negroni so fragrant with orange peel, the vermouth and Campari and gin fade to innocence in the hefty crystal tumbler. Hungover, I wake the next morning to a cold, sunny civic utopia of 18th century streets. I try to read La Stampa, which I bought at the newsstand by the Triumphal Arch at the end of the Piazza San Carlo, over macchiato and brioche in a small, darkly panelled room in the Torino. I bite into a fat dome of pastry, into thickly sweet preserve of some kind. I cannot identify it, not apricot, not fig, almost pure honey. My hangover recedes. The chessboard precision of the grid of central streets is still undisturbed by traffic. To the western end of each long Baroque vista, the Alps rise up, peaks just touched with snow, cinematic, hallucinatory, while to the east, the city drops back down towards the River Po. Now and then, as people start to crowd the streets on their way to offices, galleries, and cafes, I half see a dark-eyed man in a sand-coloured raincoat walking fast away from me, an almost smoked cigarette held between the fingers of his left hand. He is working on another poem, for his poems about the workers of Turin, the people he had grown up with the Longue Hills, now workers in factories. I'm going to stop there. And the rest of the essay is just me hot on the heels of Pavese. And I think I did, in some sense, catch up with him. Anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Unmute myself. Thank you, Mary. That was lovely. And you can read Mary's piece in full from next Thursday on the website. So now it falls for me to introduce Steve, our third and final speaker tonight. Steve Roberts' piece, Old Man River, will be published on the 25th of March, and it's going to include a video of him reading the whole piece. It's really a tour de force. It's written in the voice of a river in the Windward Island of Dominica. Steve was born and grew up in Dominica. In summer 2020, he completed an MA in Creative Writing and Education at Goldsmiths. His work was featured in Goldsmiths issue 3 of Storymakers Dialogues. He has published poetry and performed at the Domfesta Poetry Against Violence Festival in Dominica in 2016. He continues to develop a very exciting project, Black Reflections, his debut courier poem, which is a form that combines poetry, dance, music and song, and which premiered at the Woodford Festival in October 2018. Please welcome Steve Roberts to read from Old Man River. Steve.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pam. Yeah, Old Man River, it's a piece that I wrote as one of my assignments on the MA in Creative Writing course. And I've written it in Creole or Dominican, as it were. And part of the reasoning for that is my desire, I suppose, to work towards decolonizing creative writing. I took part in a conference hosted by Francis in November, where I did a reading from Old Man River. And I write because I think my writing should be in my speaking style, my rhythm and syntax. And I chose to write the piece as a short story because I've tended previously to write poetry. So I was trying something different, trying a piece of prose. And I wrote it as a short story where the river welcomes back a man who left the island when he was younger and takes him on an oral journey through the social, the political and cultural events that have impacted on the island life in his absent years. And that man, in effect, was myself. And I really was thinking about a river where, as a young boy, I used to go with the family to have picnics on the riverbank. And later on, I would go with my friends and we would spend most of the day bathing and romping in the river and just enjoying the country. And I left the island in my late teens. So I've been away for a while, but I've kept in close touch and spent quite a lot of time over the years back there. So I really wanted Old Man River to be a base from which learners, particularly young people in London with family ties in Dominica, could explore history in relation to themselves and their families, the social issues such as the environmental preservation or conservation, and the impact that natural disasters can have on small nation states. I'm going to be reading the opening paragraphs, but later on the story touches on the impact of recent hurricanes on the island. And for me, it could also introduce the music, arts, and culture of Dominica, and by extension, the Caribbean, or wherever people's families relate to as home. Old Man River. The man climbed gingerly down the riverbank, his new trainers seeking the least muddy path to the river. The afternoon sun glistened on the water, flowing downstream against a backdrop of birdsong. He felt a sense of calm as he jumped from rock to rock to nestle on the biggest rock in the middle of the river. The river seemed much narrower now than back in the day, and the gushing current also felt less powerful. The roaring bass in the river's voice was as strong as ever, though. Is where you was, boy? Long time self I don't see you. You look like you was in foreign, though. I sense you crossing the bridge over the years. Sometimes regular, and then there would be a gap. I suppose the gaps is when you're out there in your new world. I remember when you was a little boy, and you used to come with your Auntie Dolly and them. And all you would sometime have a run-in with the stinging nettle on my bank. You know that Gable mentioned your Auntie Dolly in one of his stories in his book called Rain on a Tin Roof? Yes, she used to run the clock shop by the old market in the middle of Roseau. A slim but tough woman with a very kind heart. Then when you was older, you used to come by here regular with Natty Mervyn and them Canefield posse. Is posse all you used to call it? Yes? It's a long time since a lot of them fellas visit, so it make it even more special to have you. I feel well good that you remember me and come to spend some time with me. So where you be now? How foreign treating you now? I hope you come and spend some good time with me, eh? It have so much for me to tell you, boy. Is what year you leave us now? Must have been about 75 or 76, innit? I remember all you used to come down here from Roger and Canefield, and all you would cook pot full of dumpling, beans, and pig snout. I wonder if you still jamming on the pork. All you would eat and bathe and use glory cedar bush and locks all your head, taunting the police and all your parents. It was a dangerous game to play, though. It was a time when Babylon police was chasing down Rasta all over the place. I even hear people say they used to kill them Rasta in the hills and bury them there self. Man and man was just disappearing and them family don't know what happened to them. When I chill out in the hills with them other rivers, we just talk about all them Rasta Babylon shoot down in the hills. Things was dread in them times. What with the dread act and all that? Anyways, Jah live and the Naya Bingi live. It does be so nice when Rasta come and free up in my waters, praising his imperial majesty to the Most High. He did come to the Caribbean in 1966, you know, but he never reached us here in Dominica. I remember how one Sunday, after all you leave me, all you walk down to Donkey Beach, round by Dumcan. Talking about Dumcan, you know it's an airport that there now? Yes, boy, the government closed down the timber business that was using the hardwoods in the forest to make board and other things. They say Patrick John built that airport to make it easier for him to slip out of the country. When he wanted to go meet them man, he was plotting and scheming to sell the country to. Where I was now? Oh yes, that Sunday, after all you finish bathing, all you going up the shortcut to go Rouge. But Edward decided to go Massac on his own. He had proper locks, you know. So next thing, Sugarfly and them other Babylon heading downtown from Massac. They pull up and grab Edward to take him down to police headquarters in town. They rough him up in the van. And when they reach headquarters, they chop off his dreads and chuck him in caboose for the night. It was a really dreadful time, eh, boy? So where you say you be? England? The motherland, eh? Way, Papa. You're in the heart of the empire. And I'll stop there. It goes on to talk about the politics and developments in the country, the divisions between the political parties, and the most recent hits of the hurricanes, particularly Hurricane Maria, that destroyed a significant percentage of the island. But the island's fighting back and the people are fighting back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. And you'll be able to read and hear Steve. So you'll be able to read that text as Steve reads when we publish in March. So thank you really very much. Thank you to all 3 readers. And I'm looking at comments here coming in. Lots of wonderful, thank you, beautifully read. And I'm just scrolling through for questions, and I saw one came in quite early on to Sarah from Michelle, who says, I know you like paper and stationery and such things. Can you describe the sensation of touching the same piece of paper that your quarry had touched? And the fact that paper, that connection between you comes from trees and irony. Can you speak to that, Sarah, if you unmute yourself?
Okay, yeah. It did feel like that. It's quite a heavy book, actually. So it was, good to take round. I would love it if he'd have written something, if I'd have got some of his handwriting. But it's definitely a link there. And actually, there was one time, which I write about in the essay, where I found out he'd done something sort of very fine to get the gallantry cross, and I found myself going to the book and kind of patting the book to say well done. So it was as if there was a link there. But I think this is the joy of non-fiction books, because you're looking up something that the person who owned the book before had also looked up, so you're almost following the same paths through the books. But yeah, and yeah, the fact it's made of paper, obviously. I don't know which tree. I mean, that maybe that will be one thing. We always have the typeface at the back, but maybe we'll have what tree the paper came from.
Yeah. One more question for Sarah. Barbara was intrigued by the weaving, the structure. Can you talk a bit about the process of how you worked on that and got that plaiting to work?
Yeah, I didn't start with that as the idea at all. So it wasn't like I found out a bit about D.H. Hardwick and then wrote a bit about me or whatever. So I started writing his story, really. And then it just felt, just too much of a coincidence. It was an extraordinary, like one of those tingle moments when he had been in hospital, when he'd ordered this book with obviously something wrong with his lungs, and there was I tottering around with my lungs. So it started off just as his story, and I was writing my own story. And then when I started to put them together, it fitted in more. So it was more in the editing, I would say, that the weaving came in. But then they started to speak to each other, the 2 stories, and I really liked that.
Great. Now there was a question here for Mary about the use of present tense. Another process question, Mary.
I have to say my relationship with tenses is strictly instinctive and intuitive. I mean, I know I've got friends who are trained EFL teachers and they're quite the opposite, but I find if I start to examine tenses and think, well, should it be this or should it be that, they all start to feel weird and cumbersome and so I just trust to my intuition. I do think that working in the present, if you're trying to hold on to an experience and to express it to other people, there is a huge power in the present tense that other tenses don't possess. But I don't have any rules about them. I'd be very wary of, I think you just have to go with what feels right as you're writing, read it over. If it still sounds right, then it's going to be fine. So it's not a very sophisticated view, I know, but that's how I feel about tenses.
And we've got a lot coming in from Steve. You've mesmerised people. Charlie Allenby says, felt transported there, Steve. So much, enchanting stories vividly expressed. That was gorgeous. Sounded wonderful. Alex Joseph is asking, will there be more? I mean, would you you know, what about a full-length book in that voice? Is that too much? Or maybe, if not a river, then something else, or yourself?
Uh, um, thanks for that. The short story itself is about what, 2,600 words. I don't know. I may well expand it, just building on the style.
Mm.
Um, really, it's a style that, to me, especially being away from the island and going back home, and part of the ritual of returning is that you go around visiting family and especially the older members of the family. And you tend to have these conversations that just they flit around. Um, so they be telling you what's happened to auntie whatever, and then they'll come back to the present day politics, and then they'll flip back. So that's what I was trying to capture. Is
Yeah.
that whole style of
Well, it's
uh,
somebody's asking here, did the voice of the river come from a person you know, a parent or grandparent? So I think that's what you're saying, really, isn't it?
yes. In my longer in my piece of poetry, I've got one a poem that is called Old Man, and that's dedicated to my grandfather. I grew up with my grandparents in Dominica. Um, and that poem was about on one of my visits, we did a little tour around the island, and around the village, and although he, as an older Caribbean man, he wasn't very expressive in terms of love and hugs and all of that, but in his own way, he showed it. And then one night we just went for a walk and spent some time drinking and chatting. And that poem just kind of brings out the conversation we had. So in a sense, when I was looking at all manner of it, it's like just remembering a place where I was very happy, we had very good times,
Mm.
and making that significant of the river,
And it's
and then
almost
linking
like,
it to my granddad, who I loved
yeah,
a lot and enjoyed being with.
it's almost like the affection is in the language, isn't it? And in the way that to and fro. There's another question for Steve here. When you're writing, are you conscious of the words being read in people's head rather than having the joy of hearing you read? And what difference does that make in your choices?
So,
Mm.
I suppose I tend to write my poetry more as more spoken word. So I tend to be writing as if
Performing, yeah.
I'm performing it. So or I'm having a conversation with
Mm.
whether with myself
Yeah,
or somebody else,
yeah,
or I'm being a narrator or being somebody else talking to somebody. So that's where that kind of I tend to be I tend to be hearing it as a conversation,
yeah. It's more performance for you,
more
isn't it?
performance,
Definitely.
a
That's
conversation.
the, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a question from Sarah to Steve and Mary. So we'll give Steve a break. Mary answer first and then Steve. Do you think that being a poet changes your prose writing, particularly memoir? Mary.
Well, I'm sure it influences it. I think when I'm writing prose, whatever it is, short fiction, memoir, fashion piece, anything, I'm much more concerned about getting through to a reader. And I find writing poetry, I have a sense of a greater freedom. I'm not worried about what the reader's going to think with the poem. But it is there when I write prose, this sense of a responsibility that it's got to make sense. And of course, writing a poem, you get away from that sense of responsibility to other people, and it's completely different freedom in writing poetry. But I think, regularly writing poetry, reading poets, maybe gives you a sense of how to use detail that you wouldn't get if you weren't doing that.
Mm. Thank you. Steve, do you want to add anything to that? Your experience of writing poetry, do you think it changes changes how you write prose or memoir? I think you need to unmute, do you? Yeah.
Yeah, I have unmuted. I think it's particularly around this piece, because this is the first piece I've really kind of written and put out there, and got involved with reading to other people and sharing that much. In terms of the poetry, I suppose I tend to be writing the poems almost like on a spur, a feeling, a thought, an event. Whereas to me, writing, and in a sense, I suppose I was bringing that to the short story because I was conscious of it being a conversation, of it, but being conscious of the place that I was writing about and almost going back there. And thinking too of the way that my grandfather would be talking to me if he was relating these stories to me. So I think there is a crossover.
Yeah.
Might be a slightly different thought pattern, but the expression is kind of similar, I think.
I got a question for Sarah, because you write in every genre, and I was just picking up on Mary's point about being conscious of the reader, and I wondered how in writing this piece, how conscious of a reader were you, or conscious of your own exploration of that journey?
Yeah, when I did come out of hospital, I wrote several blog posts about the experience because it was quite new, and I knew that, you know, people wanted to know what they should do really, and that was very much for for a reader. You know, what would someone in the situation I had found myself in want to know? What would I want to do? And I was a journalist for a long time, so you know that's how I work. But this piece, I wasn't thinking about the reader so much, actually. It was more to sort out, it was kind of like a love affair to this book in some ways, really. And then, you know, working out how I fitted in, but also, you know, reaction to nature and all sorts of things. So, yes, I wasn't thinking about the reader so much in this, but hopefully it's open to a reader as well.
And you write poetry too, and do you feel a bit like Mary, you know, you're not thinking about the reader then?
Yes, but no, I think I probably start everything that I start writing, whatever it is, I write thinking that there won't be a reader. I think if you start off thinking about a reader, then you're going to be hampered right from the beginning. So then probably it works the other way. You know, with poetry, it's sort of opening up to, well, what isn't, what can't be understood, and what's going to work. And yeah, I think prose, there is a different relationship. I think prose is much more reader led in some ways.
Yeah, I think at the end, the editing of prose, you are having to think of the reader, aren't you? You do have to make it accessible.
Very good critics, actually, very good workshop. But you know, I workshop all my writing, and I've got some of them here actually, and they're very, you know, I think sometimes you can get so much in your head, you know exactly what it is that you want to say, that it makes perfect sense. So it's really interesting when someone says, I've got not a clue what's going on here, or yeah, I don't need to know so much about, you know, L.F. Brindle or something. Yeah.
Thanks. Mary, a question from Michelle. What is your favourite Pavese poem and why? No pressure there then.
Really difficult. His quite complex in that his work falls into two phases. There are two long collections about the working people of Turin, interspersed with landscape poems. A lot of them are vignettes of street life, and they're all really enjoyable. And then his last collection, where he had a very depressive personality, and he'd been fighting it off all his life, but in the end it gets the upper hand. And his later poems, there's a very short attenuated blues, and he loved American poetry. He'd done a thesis on Whitman, and he was really up to date with contemporary American poetry, and it influenced him enormously, and you can see that in the later little blues poems. And out of the two, I think if I had to push myself to choose, in the earlier, longer city narrative poems, there's a wonderful poem called Passion for Solitude, which is just being alone in his room, eating supper, and the city's getting quieter. And he's thinking about how everybody is settling down after a day's work and the stars are coming out. And a sense of what it is like to be alive at a moment like that. It's a beautiful poem. And then out of the tragic blues at the end, there's a irresistible poem for me, because I do love cats, called The Cats Will Know, which is a mysterious little lyric about a vision of a sort of moment of paradise, of his city in the rain, but where magically, wonderfully, everything is all right. Lovely poem. So those are the two. If I'm pushed into a corner, I would say, but I like them all. It's very hard to choose.
Thanks. Barbara has spotted the poetry in Sarah's piece. I love the way it had a poetry-like openness, very suggestive, full of gaps, with a lot of space for the reader to think and interpret and sense your experience, a huge strength of the piece. So I guess that is another connection to poetry, isn't it? The leaving the gaps and, you know, the influence. Any more questions? Oh, Michelle's saying, I agree about I gatti. I can't say the Italian. Where are you, Michelle? Unmute and say it yourself.
Gatti lo sapranno.
Okay. Yeah.
Accent.
So she's agreeing with you.
Yeah, it's
Any
lovely.
more questions? Well, I am going to put in here, if it will let me, I'm going to say, do sign up for our newsletter. So that, this is always happens with me. Somehow I never, why won't it post? No, it's not doing it. If I email this to Francis, for some reason it won't let me post in the chat, and I don't know why.
And just email it to me and I'll
Yeah,
sure.
I just wanted to, no, it's not doing it anyway. Right, so what, can we just all unmute and give a big thank you to all of our readers, and if any of you would like to hang around and chat to our writers, please do. Oh, there we go. Oh, it's just not it's not appearing, and I don't know why. So frustrating. So do come in, unmute and chat to your writer friends while I try and get this email address in the chat.
Are you pressing return, Pam?
Yep, I am. I'm doing, it's finally come up. Yep. And I'm going to try and put this submissions notice in. I don't know why this happens to me, but there we go. It's happened before. Hi, Kelly. No, it's not coming up. Anyway, so the Blue Door Press newsletter contact is there. And if you've got a piece and you want to contact us, that's the same address. Hopefully it will come up. It's maybe just that people are, yeah, everyone's thanking.